Well, Rod, you've certainly arrived at a fascinating time. We'll talk about Israel Folau in a second, and I also want to hear about your new book, which is looking at particularly how the West seems to be drifting into soft totalitarianism. But first of all, let's discuss your personal background. You went from Protestantism to Catholicism, and now you actually label yourself as under the Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Church. Tell us about your personal story, Rod.
Yeah, I've covered the waterfront, Rowan. I was raised in a non-observant Protestant family in South Louisiana, had a very strong conversion to Catholicism in my 20s, and was a rather militant conservative Catholic and journalist in Washington and New York for my 20s and 30s. But then I began to write about the abuse scandal in the early 2000s, which, as you know, decimated the American church. I always thought that as long as I could have the arguments for the faith clear in my head, that my faith would be able to survive anything. Turns out that wasn't the case. I was shattered by all the things I learned after a few years, and eventually became an Eastern Orthodox Christian, not because I think the Orthodox Church is free of sin, no church is free of sin, but because I simply couldn't believe as a Catholic anymore.
That's fascinating. Well, you write for the New York Times, you have written for the New York Post, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. You write a lot for the American Conservative. Your best-selling book, which I just mentioned, The Benedict Option, translated into 10 different languages. Tell us the main thesis of that, because it's a fascinating story about how you see the role now, or the place, for observant Christians in our modern society.
That's right. I believe that we are at a point in the West right now that is analogous to the collapse of the Roman Empire in the late 6th century. And I think that just as St. Benedict of Nursia, the founder of monasticism in Western Europe, he emerged out of the ruins of Rome to build a way of living out the faith that was resilient amid the chaos and darkness of the early Middle Ages, and laid the groundwork for the rebirth of Christian civilization in Western Europe. In our time, we need to look to St. Benedict and those monks and look at him creatively and try to figure out what we can do here and now in this post-Christian civilization to build something resilient and faithful. It's an ecumenical project. I wrote this book for faithful Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians because we really are in this together in the face of secular leftism.
Now, you said the very scary words, post-Christian society. You said it was only a couple of decades ago that to be Christian was pretty much mandatory for our political leaders. In fact, both our political leaders in this election have made a play of being Christian. You're talking about a post-Christian society. Define that for me.
Right. It doesn't mean a civilization in which there are no Christians. Clearly, there are many Christians still. What it means is that we no longer, as a civilization, understand ourselves as Christian, as defined by or in relation to the biblical narrative. This is not a time for panic, but it is a time for people who are believing Christians to wake up and understand what the challenges are to our faith and to act accordingly, to do things that can build much more resilient, deep, traditional Christian community to withstand this time of barbarism.
So how did we go from Christianity being seen as a kind of virtue, an ideal to be cherished only a few decades ago, to really now it's a code word for bigotry, for intolerance? This is how the left try and portray Christians as these dreadful, intolerant, bigoted people. How did we get there?
It's a sexual revolution. I mean, look, in the Benedict Option, I talk about the deep roots of anti-Christianity and how it really got rolling with the Enlightenment. But to be precise, for our current times, it's the sexual revolution. Christianity, for better or for worse, stands against the sexual revolution. And when we start to think of ourselves as a society in which the autonomous individual is free to decide whoever and whatever he wants to be, and when sexual expression becomes the highest goal, then naturally Christianity is going to be the villain of that society. I think in particular, the rise of the gay rights movement has been directly responsible for the demonization of Christianity among the elites, especially especially media elites, and it is spreading widely right now in the United States.
And it launched very quickly, as we warned would happen after the same-sex marriage debate here. It went very quickly from basically tolerance of homosexuality, which is tolerance is a Christian virtue. Mm-hmm. It leapt straight into not only advocacy for homosexuality, but advocacy for transgenderism, and then piled on top of that, advocacy for transgenderism for our children, which involved surgery and chemical castration and all forms of what I regard as child abuse. How did that evolution happen so fast?
It was very quick, Ron. I think it's left a lot of us cultural observers in the U.S. absolutely stunned. We thought that after the Obergefell ruling, which legalized same-sex marriage, that we would have 3 or 4 years before we had to deal with transgenderism. We had 3 or 4 months. And I think what has driven it so fast and so hard is the fact that this ideology of liberation through controlling your body and through sexual expression has captured the elites, the media elites especially. It is impossible to criticize in any way transgenderism, even if you're a medical authority. You can't do this without being called a hater and a bigot. And you get thrown off of social media. It is a form of neo-Stalinism. And I use that term consciously and intentionally, because we are building a society in which to dissent from this ideology, this rigid ideology, is to make yourself a non-person. And it's not going anywhere good.
I want to ask you about your very, very pro-Israel stance and a fascinating insight that you've got in the Benedict option, where you say you look at how the Orthodox Jewish community has survived centuries in often very hostile environments, and you see perhaps that's the way Christianity has to go. Talk me through that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Orthodox Jews are a real sign to us small o Orthodox Christians for how to be faithful to what you've been given by God in the modern world. And what they've done is they've lived in much closer physical community, which they have to do to go to the synagogue, to be able to walk to the synagogue. But that has fostered physical community. They've placed an enormous premium on education, on an authentic Jewish education. And they also live by a series of rules, keeping kosher and so forth, that run in counter, that are contrary to the sort of modern life we lead. But they do this because they love God. I think that we Christians have to look to them, even though we're not Orthodox Jews, and the rules we will have and the habits we have to develop won't be exactly the same, but they have a cohesive community and they live out the faith together in community. I want what they have, and it has been such a privilege of mine to hear from a number of Orthodox Jewish readers of the Benedict option who say, hey, we want to help you. We want to help you Christians live faithfully, because when you are strong, we're strong too.
Now, from one Israel to the other, as has been often the case recently, you're up to date with Israel Folau and our story here. That's very much a community, the island communities who are very religious. What do you make of the whole issue of Israel Folau, the condemnation of him, the burning of him at the stake for reciting basically what is in the Bible?
Yeah, it's blasphemy, right? This is blaspheming against the gods of secular liberalism. I think he's an incredibly brave man. I mean, it may have been imprudent for him to have tweeted that out, but that's beside the point. The point is he should have the right to speak his mind without losing his career. And the fact that he's been willing to surrender everything for the sake of his faith makes him a hero in my eyes, and he's somebody that the rest of us Christians need to watch. As far as I know, he thinks that I, as an Orthodox Christian, I may be going to hell too. I don't care. As long as he doesn't do anything to send me there, I'm fine with that. That's what it means to live in a pluralistic liberal society. We tolerate people who say things that we don't particularly like. I think that he's a real test case for this country and for Christians in the future. The fact that big business in Australia have been so harsh on him tells us a lot about the nature of the culture war we're in. As a conservative, I've always thought about the state as being the primary antagonist, the primary enemy, and not big business. Well, guess what? things have changed greatly. Big business is as much of a threat to religious liberty and to what a lot of conservatives like me believe as is the state.
And Rod, what is fascinating is your next book, you actually look at how soft totalitarianism and totalitarianism we saw in the 1930s used big business in many ways to push forward its own political agendas, and you had a stifling effect in East Germany, other countries. Your latest book, your next book, you're looking at this very issue. You've been in what were the former Eastern Soviet countries and communist countries. Tell us how you see the similarities between where we are going now and what they went through in those communist countries.
Well, for the past few years, Rowan, I've been hearing from people in the United States and the UK who were raised under communism but who got out, who have been telling me that the things they're seeing arise in the Western liberal democracies today remind them of communism. And I ask them, why is that? Primarily, it's a matter of political correctness and the way that the left will destroy you politically and personally for crossing their ideological boundaries. And it's the way that so many people are giving over their private data to Google, to Facebook, and to these big companies with no expectation that this information might be used against them. I've been traveling in communist countries, formerly communist countries, recently, and will be there all fall, talking to Christians and others who endured communism and trying to find out from them, how did you do this? What can we learn from you about how to deal with this kind of oppression, with having your name ruined, your career ruined, because you offend the secular gods, the politically correct gods? What can we do about it? How can we identify it, and how can we resist it? I think they have a lot to tell us. We don't think it can happen here. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the greatest dissident of the 20th century, he said at the beginning of the Gulag Archipelago that the great secret is what happened to us in the Soviet Union could happen anywhere on Earth. We've got to wake up.
Well, Rod Dreher, thank you for helping us wake up. People can read your book, obviously, The Benedict Option, also read you on American Conservative and elsewhere, and follow you on Twitter. Thank you so much, Rod Dreher, for speaking to us on Outsiders.
Thanks for having me.